the Lord's heavenly temple suddenly erupts with smoke. Flying above the throne and with 6 wings are creatures wreathed in power, calling out in exaltation. Their worship is so intense, the very doorposts and thresholds of the temple quake under the weight of glory. Isaiah is nearly undone by what he sees, when one of the creatures turns to him, approaching with a burning coal in hand. The account of the seraphim is one of the least understood images in all of Scripture, and when I look at how these have been depicted throughout history, rarely do they even match Isaiah's descriptions. And now more and more people are turning to AI to visualize Scripture, rather than going to the Word themselves. Today I'm going to try to correct for this by drawing what Isaiah actually saw, and what's more, show why this one scene embodies one of the most important lessons of all Scripture. If you do a search of seraphim online, most of the images fall into one of 2 mistakes. 1, they either show winged creatures with a central face or eyeball, often accompanied by dozens of other eyes. Or 2, they're stereotypical fantasy angels that just tack on more pairs of wings and call it a seraph. That is, a single seraphim. So much for biblically accurate angels, huh? So what does the Bible actually say about the seraphim? Well, some 2,700 years ago, the prophet Isaiah recorded his vision in chapter 6.
I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but this is all we get for the seraphim. And did you hear anything about a giant eye or wheels or swords? Because I didn't, but those features will come in other beings that we'll cover in this series. And this is where we can begin to correct for some of those mistakes I mentioned. For one, the wings are covering the face. How these exactly look is up to some interpretation, and I designed them here coming from the scapula, over the shoulders and then in front of the face. Scripture doesn't tell us how large these wings need to be, but they apparently don't need all 6 to fly, so I've allowed this pair to be smaller and designed more tightly around the head. But why cover the face anyway? This could be to veil their own faces from beholding the overwhelming splendor of God. But I believe there's another possibility, because maybe they are able to witness God's glory as his throne guardians. Elsewhere, when people are allowed to witness even a fraction of this glory, their faces become so radiant they must be covered like the seraphim are doing here. Check out these verses in Exodus 34. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, his face shone because he had been talking with God. Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. So do you see the link? Both Moses and the seraphim encounter the glory of God, making their faces so radiant that they must be veiled to those they approach, such as the seraphim approaching Isaiah. The next pair of wings covers its feet. One interpretation for this comes from how, in ancient Hebrew culture, feet were considered a lowly part of the body that required special treatment before God. So the seraphim concealing their feet could be humility before his presence. Think of Moses having to remove his sandals before God in the burning bush, or of Peter's initial refusal to let Jesus wash his feet. This gesture by the seraphim signals their recognition of their own limitations, even as high-ranking celestial beings. And finally, the wings on the back, which it uses to fly. You'll note that I chose to draw these distinct from its arms and hands. Some depictions of the seraphim combine its arms and wings into one like a bird, but that seems less likely to me given how it's described as flying to Isaiah while holding the altar tongs at the same time. Oh, and you'll notice that I drew this seraph as masculine. In most translations, Isaiah refers to the seraphim as a he. However, that's because the Hebrew word for seraphim is grammatically masculine. It doesn't necessarily mean that Isaiah saw biologically male beings or specific masculine anatomy. I also took artistic license in drawing the seraph wearing a robe in a masculine style for that same reason, and for the sake of modesty. Now, you might be wondering about the serpentine bracers. Well, this is another artistic interpretation I'm adding, but there's good reason for it. To learn why, we need to understand what the word seraphim even means. The root word for seraph is Seraph, which appears throughout the Old Testament and has two primary meanings. One, to burn, or two, a serpent, which makes sense when thinking about the burning sensation of venom. Some scholars take that connotation even further than I have in this drawing. They argue that the seraphim shouldn't look humanoid at all, and that the serpentine connection isn't just linguistic, but also literal. We'll explore that possibility in the next video, but for now this is why I've drawn the seraphim as humanoid rather than serpentine, and why I gave it serpentine bracers as an allusion to that etymology. The meaning of the seraphim as a burning one, however, is what we need to focus on now, and is maybe the most important thing that the biblical bestiary has talked about yet. It's time we address the coal. In verse 6 we read that one of the seraphim flew to Isaiah, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And with that coal he touched Isaiah's mouth and said, "Your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for." And while these symbols might feel foreign to us today, they would have made perfect sense to Isaiah, especially as coals and altars relate to the daily ritual work of the priesthood. The coal purifying his mouth also links to the prophetic role that Isaiah would play in being a mouthpiece for the Lord to speak through. However, these symbols are just as relevant to you and I as they were to Isaiah, not only because of how the New Testament calls us to function as a priesthood, proclaiming the light of God to the world, and not only because we as Christians are warned about keeping our mouth clean from impure speech, but because of how the coal took away Isaiah's guilt and atoned for his sins. The coal is a symbol of Christ himself. Something that struck me while meditating on these verses is the presence of the altar in this heavenly vision. In Isaiah's day, the altar was used to burn offerings to the Lord, and was placed at the threshold between the earthly sanctuary and God's most intimate presence. And it was where the priests would make sacrifices for the temporary atonement of the people's sins. Yet, the altar in this vision isn't overseen by the priests, but by the enthroned Lord himself, tended to by his seraphim. And this is what we cannot miss about these verses. Isaiah isn't the one tending to the altar in this vision. God is. But what use would God have for the altar? What offering would the King of Kings possibly sacrifice? Well, for his own sake, nothing. But for our sake, everything. Whereas Isaiah and the other priests needed to make routine sacrifices on the altar for temporary atonement, God placed his own Son on that same altar to purchase our permanent atonement and salvation. Jesus became the ultimate coal, offering himself as a sacrifice and purifying us from our sin once and for all. See, the seraphim aren't just epic heavenly creatures meant to stir our imaginations. They're real spiritual beings that point us to Christ. They function not only to proclaim God's glory, but to show us the only way that we can truly be set free from guilt and sin. And that is what the heart of the biblical bestiary is all about. Every creature either points directly to Christ or our need for him. He is the one way, the one truth, and the one life. If this video blessed you, then like and subscribe so the algorithm pushes it out to more people, not just for my platform, but for the spreading of the gospel. If you would like to go deeper into the art though, I've made a Patreon with additional resources and behind-the-scenes content that you can check out. But until next time, God bless and keep creating.